I dropped the spoon. It clattered against the ceramic bowl and rang through the kitchen like a small, ridiculous alarm. And for a moment, I laughed because what else do you do when your life tilts on its axis and you're not sure whether you're angry or stunned or already grieving? Then my laugh broke off into something raw and hollow. The TV in the corner, the one I never watched in the evenings because I liked my quiet, was on the local evening news. There he was. My son in a tux, smiling too widely in the glow of studio lights, the caption below him saying, "Local couple wed, groom's name Michael Carter." My name didn't appear. No stock footage of our backyard where he learned to ride a bike, no clip of the college apartment I'd helped furnish. Just the face I had folded into my life for 28 years, and a voice I recognized from 1,000 good mornings and bad nights saying, "We're so happy," and a woman I didn't know slipping her hand into his. I had asked him over the phone that afternoon if he could come for dinner. He had been vague, the way people are when they're trying to avoid a question without actually lying. "Mom, I don't think I can make it tonight. Busy." Busy. 2 tiny syllables that in my head expanded into some monstrous, unknowable thing. I set an extra place out anyway, because the kitchen looked better with one more plate, because habits are stubborn, and grief and hope are almost interchangeable when you are used to expecting someone at your table. I stared at the screen until the segment ended and the anchor moved on to the weather. Then my hands moved before my brain did. I called him. Straight to voicemail. I called his number again and again until the line went dead. I called my ex-husband. He didn't answer either. I called the number of his old friend Tommy. It rang busy. I called my neighbor, because you call people like neighbors when you don't know what else to do. And she told me gently, "Oh, honey, you okay? You sound upset." When I finally reached him the next morning, he was calm as if the world had not shifted under my feet. "Mom," he said, like that was the explanation I'd needed all along. "We did it yesterday. It was small. We didn't want a big thing. I didn't think..." His voice trailed off, and for once, I did not fill in the silence. I let it hang there like a dropped coat. "You weren't invited?" I asked. It wasn't a question I needed him to dodge. I needed him to say it plainly. He did. "No. I'm sorry." The apology sat in my chest like a stone. I wanted to scream at him for the selfishness of secrecy, for the assumption that I was disposable, for the way he thought of our family as something optional. I wanted to demand why? Did he not think of me while he signed a life-changing paper? Did she not think of me when she slipped into whatever dress she wore? Did they not consider that in the ordinary course of being my son, I might be one of the first to know? But what came out was a quieter thing, probably softer than it should have been. "Congratulations," I said. "If you're happy, I'm happy for you." It was a lie and the truth both. Then I hung up, because listening to him make small talk while a new life unfurled without me felt like being asked to applaud a stranger for stealing my seat. The thing about betrayal is it often comes wrapped in normality. People keep their jobs, they smile at family barbecues, they post pictures of new houses, and the world keeps moving. But the small acts that make up the shape of a life, phone calls, shared traditions, simple courtesies, these are the threads that stitch people together. When a person picks at those threads, sometimes they do it with malice, sometimes with carelessness, sometimes simply because they have folded a new life into their hands and can't see the ones they've left behind. For me, the unraveling smelled of soap in the lemon of the dishwashing liquid I'd used that morning, but for weeks afterwards, I could not get the image of that smile off my mind. It haunted me in the disorienting hours between waking and sleep, in the mornings when the house was too quiet. My son Michael had always been the kind of practical man who liked order, spreadsheets for his budget, 5-year plans taped to his fridge, a roster of important dates he kept on his phone. He had been thoughtful in ways that other people described as casual, remembering to pick up my prescriptions, rearranging a broken step for my safety, bringing home books he'd thought I'd enjoy. He was the boy who at 8 years old had crawled into my bed during thunderstorms to hold my hand. He was the teenager who came home from college and asked if I needed anything fixed around the house. I had been proud in a way that made me fondly ridiculous, the kind of mother who bragged and fretted and smoothed his shirts before interviews. But there had always been a distance, small, manageable, the kind that comes from letting a child make their own way. When he moved into that downtown apartment with a roommate, I worried less. When he started dating someone different every few months, I kept my questions light. When he called less often, I told myself he was busy. The truth is, you'll let your child go without noticing the inches changing into miles, until one day you realize they are an unfamiliar country. The woman on the TV that day, her name, I would learn later, was Emily, looked like someone who belonged perfectly in the frame next to him. She had a calm certainty that made people follow her. She laughed with the practiced ease of someone who had learned how to make a room open. In the photos the station ran, she wore a ring and leaned toward him with the affectionate ease of a new partner. I didn't hate her. I hated the space she had taken without letting me know it existed. For a long time, my anger and my loneliness braided into the same tight rope. I did what people do when they want to make sense of pain. I thought back to the times that had seemed like warnings. The canceled visits, the sudden long work hours, the excuse about a new project that happened to coincide with a weekend I'd planned to visit. I replayed conversations for tone and subtext like a juror hunting for wrongdoing in the cadence of a voice. It isn't that there had been a single cruel act, it was 1,000 small choices, each one tiny enough to be laughable until they accumulated into something undeniable. He excluded me from a wedding. He excluded me from a life. That exclusion did not feel like a personal slight alone. It felt like a ledger being kept, like an inventory of belonging, and I had taken a look and found my name absent. For the first week, when rationality still tried to hold me, I tried to be reasonable. I sent him a message, short, caring, and he replied with 3 polite words. I tried not to barge in physically, to be the parent who respects boundaries. But boundaries are polite when they are mutual. When they become a one-way street, when you're the only one expected to respect them, they start to feel like a lock. I should have been concerned then for my son's sense of decency. Instead, I began to plan. Maybe it's a human thing. When someone you love becomes a stranger, you attempt to reclaim the narrative. People steal photographs back from albums when they feel erased. People remake themselves in the image of the life they want. I decided, slowly, immovably, to do something with my anger that had weight and consequence. Not violence, never that. I am not a vengeful person, my temperament, but I had assets. The house we had mortgaged together years ago, the small but respectable amount saved for emergencies, the name on some accounts that, because of a clumsy oversight, still had my signature. I had things that could be leveraged. More than that, I had knowledge. There are places where improprieties ripple in ways visible to those who watch closely. I had worked my whole life making sure things were correct, legal, above board. I knew how to make a paper trail look like coincidence and how to turn a tiny legal advantage into a significant one. "Would you really go after him?" my sister asked the second week when I told her everything. Her voice on the phone was a mix of caution and curiosity. "Be honest, would you have waited this long for payback?" she said, teasing the harder edge of the question. It made me smile because it was honest and reckoning in the same breath. I said yes, not because I wanted to hurt him for the sake of hurting him, but because he'd taken granted the scaffolding of our relationship. He'd treated our shared history like a disposable backdrop for his new life. I wanted him to feel the gravity of what he'd done. I wanted him to face a consequence that matched the scale of what he'd done.
So I started small and clever. I asked for copies of old naming documents, mortgage papers, small business registration documents for the consultancy we'd once helped him start. I hired, for a few hours, a paralegal friend who owed me a favor to run a search on property records and liens. I called a financial advisor under the guise of wanting to update estate planning and asked casually how one might protect oneself from being casually written out of things. I took notes. I learned that there were procedural details people often overlooked. Signatures needing renewal, accounts needing a joint affirmation, wills that default to legal heirs only if properly executed. I wasn't planning a legal ambush. I was planning leverage. Leverage that could be used to make him see me as a factor he could not ignore. The foundation of my plan had to be defensible, something built on legitimate rights and paperwork rather than rumor or sensation. I could have screamed on social media. I could have sat in the front of his workplace with a sign and a bag of sandwiches. Instead, I concentrated on two practical things: the house and the trust. The house, where he had lived as a child and which still had my name on an old deed. The trust, the document that, if left unchecked, would allow an intentional omission to stand as permanent. I updated my will with the help of the attorney we'd used for years. I named specific distributions to nieces and nephews, to my sister, to charities I loved. But crucially, I also filed a codicil that explicitly described the house as a joint asset, with conditions for its sale that required the consent of all named beneficiaries. It was legal and odd, and would, if contested, force any challenger to address the matter in court. The attorney warned me, gently, that what I was doing might startle people, that it would force negotiation. Good, I thought. That was the point. My goal was not stupid. When he saw the notice on the county website, because these things, when filed, become a matter of public record, he called like a man who had dropped a glass and was trying to stop it shattering. "Mom, why would you do this?" he demanded. The exasperation in his voice was a kind of entitlement I recognized and had tolerated for years. I said, "Because you didn't tell me, because I deserve the respect of being told." He accused me of trying to control him. He accused me of grandstanding. He accused me of making everything about myself. He was, in many ways, right. I had made everything about myself. I had taken my right to be acknowledged and placed it in the center of a legal stage. But control had not been the motive. The motive was fairness. A word that looked simple on paper and complicated in human relationships. There were close calls. There was the night I almost slipped and sent a message to his new wife, a short, furious, needy string of words about how the family had been erased. I sat with my thumb hovering over the send button for minutes, heart racing, and then I deleted it. I learned the hard way that revenge thrives on patience. Rushing produces mistakes. Mistakes create vulnerabilities. Like a chess player, I began to think several moves ahead. Part of the plan involved a gentle, almost brutal reclaiming of knowledge. I began to attend community events where their names came up. I became that neighbor who volunteered to organize the block's annual fundraiser and the woman who chatted at the gallery opening. I listened. People talk when they think nobody's interested. I heard about the woman's family, about how she hated formalities, about the short notice they had given to a few close friends and the downright secrecy they had kept around certain family affairs. I heard about their business and the way they had recently partnered with a new firm that promised to streamline operations. I heard enough to be cautious. When I finally met Emily at a neighborhood coffee shop where she had agreed to take a call from me out of politeness, she was smaller than I imagined, less polished in a way that made her all the more decisive. She smiled and called me ma'am, and I felt a flash of something like respect. We talked about weather and recipes and our mutual love for a certain band she and I both enjoyed. I kept my questions on the surface because you punish people silently. Revenge loses its poetry when you become obvious. She told me she loved my son. She told me their wedding had been private because her father had passed away the year before and she wanted something small. I accepted that. She wanted to connect, to find a way in. I kept my arms folded. My leverage, carefully constructed, began to show its utility when a misunderstanding with a contractor threatened to delay the small business Michael had spent years building. It was a minor licensing issue. Someone had misfiled a document, and that misfiling could have held the business in bureaucratic limbo. I could have stepped in sympathetically. Instead, I let bureaucracy do its work. I informed the attorney who represented me, still the family attorney, which complicated things, that I needed copies of any contracts involving the property and the trust. The attorney was puzzled and warned me that I was making waves. She said, this will force them to engage legally. If they want to contest the codicil or the conditions you've placed, they'll have to do it in court. I watched them scramble. They called the attorney in a series of threaded, increasingly panicked messages. Michael's voice carried a different timbre on those calls. He was no longer the serene, calculating man who had a tidy plan for everything. He was raw, unpolished, and anxious. For a brief, flickering moment, I felt a pang of something like pity. Then I remembered the way his voice had been absent that night, the way his silence had carved a new life without me. The contest became a negotiation. They sent lawyers. They tried to settle things quietly, offered conciliatory phrases, promises to make this right if I would remove the codicil. In private, the daughter-in-law, Emily, came to my house with a bouquet of awkwardly chosen peonies and a practiced apology. She handed them to me like someone offering a peace olive branch. She said, "I didn't know. I would have invited you if I had known." I studied her face the way you study a photograph. There were markings there, the creases of someone used to being believed. I did not accept the flowers. I accepted instead the dollars. They offered compensation, money to be used for settling estate matters. How bold, I thought. How small. It amounted to a sum that would, if invested, tide me over and, more importantly, signal that they wanted an easy exit. "Is that what this is about?" I asked. "Money?" She said, "No, this is how we can fix things quickly." She was ready to trade respect for convenience. I couldn't help the coldness that rose in my chest at that. Money is a useful instrument. It buries trouble and buys silence. It also reeks of an attempted erasure. I refused the offer, not because the money was insufficient, though it was, but because the gesture implied that my history could be purchased for a small price. They escalated. They threatened a civil suit if I didn't remove the codicil. They painted me, in thinly veiled letters to mutual friends and in pointed conversations, as an unreasonable mother who preferred drama to reconciliation. The community, predictably and painfully polarized. There were those who sympathized and those who rolled their eyes at my stubbornness. Some family members urged me to relent for the sake of peace. The table where I had once set an extra plate now was a political theater. Every conversation became a referendum. I could have folded then, taken the money, smiled at the camera, and praised family unity. Instead, I used transparency as a tool. I started to make public what had been quietly legal. I posted notices, not inflammatory, but factual, about the state of the trust and the conditions I had set. I explained in measured language that my actions were designed to protect the house and ensure that it could not be quietly sold without the consent of those who had a legitimate claim. I asked questions that were simple and humiliating. When had my son felt that excluding his mother was acceptable? The Facebook comment section became a small, messy courtroom. People lectured me, cheered for me, and wrote things I would later delete because bitterness has a way of showing itself in the punctuation of the heart. There were low moments, late at night with a mug of tea cooling in my hands, when I wondered if I had turned into someone I wouldn't recognize. Had I become petty? Had the bite of being left out turned me into a person who would weaponize legal procedure to inflict pain? I answered myself frankly, perhaps. But there is a difference between pettiness and protection. When people rewrite your place in their narrative without asking, you become eligible for defensive measures. I told myself that over and over, in whatever backstage places people call self-justification. The tide turned when an independent reporter, a woman who loved neighborhood drama almost as much as she loved facts, picked up on the story. She called me for an interview under the premise of explaining how ordinary estate law can trip up families. I told her, carefully, and without venom, about the basics of what had happened, about the hurt of being excluded. She published a piece that was not sensational, but human, an exploration of belonging and entitlement. It painted me as a wronged mother trying to safeguard a home that had literal and figurative bones of family memory. The piece reached a wider audience than I expected. People responded with messages of neighborly support, with stories of similar exclusions, with a solidarity that warmed me. A funny thing happened then. Sympathy began to translate into leverage. When Michael saw it, friends and old colleagues reaching out with questions, he suddenly found himself answering more than he wanted to. The narrative that had been a quiet, private matter now smelled of publicity. That publicity cost him something important, his neat, curated image. He could not post a picture of domestic bliss without some friend privately asking, "Is your mom okay?" He could not sign a new contract at work without a curious HR person asking whether they were prepared for a potential family litigation. Reputation, it turned out, is a currency too. When we finally sat down at the attorney's office with lawyers on either side and the notarized paperwork between us, I felt something like relief. The negotiation that followed was long and measured. They wanted to dismiss the codicil. I wanted clear recognition, a written apology in which Michael acknowledged the hurt he caused, and an agreement to include me in certain family milestones, and a financial settlement that would recognize the intangible cost of exclusion. The lawyer, who had been neutral for years, had a look that could be described as cautious amusement. She said, "This is not what estate planning usually looks like," she said gently, but she also reminded them that legal recognition of harm, forms, words, signatures, has a way of being the glue people need to act differently. They balked at the apology clause. They said it was performative, that they would rather negotiate money. I pushed back. Apology is a particular kind of accountability. Money can buy silence. A written acknowledgement is a harder thing to walk away from. I wanted the moral ledger balanced, not just a transaction. I wanted him to know, in a place that mattered, that he'd been wrong. I wanted him to sign something that could not be erased with a deleted text message. In the end, we reached a settlement that felt proportionate. The house would remain protected under the terms I had written, but the conditions were softened. A mediating class would be triggered if sale was on the table, requiring mediation before any transfer could be executed. Michael agreed to a written apology, short, awkward, but unmistakable. He agreed to include me in certain family events and to update his contact list with an emergency note that perhaps, in the future, would prompt him to call. They offered to donate a sum to a charity I loved, which I accepted with a careful face. Emotionally, it felt like a truce stitched with bandages. Legally, it felt like a win.
Some will call it small. It was small in the sense that the world's outrages are infinite and that all of this could be described as a domestic tiff. But for me, it was everything. I had raised and loved a man who, in a moment of choice, decided to exclude me. I had turned that exclusion into something that forced him to reconsider how he claimed the world. What was most surprising was what happened to me on the other side. An unexpected, gentle settling. I woke up lighter on mornings after the settlement. The air around the kitchen seemed less sharp. I found myself laughing more easily. I took the charity money and arranged for a memorial tree to be planted in a park I loved. A small, living thing that would, in time, mark the days ahead and remind me that new growth is possible after cuttings. There was one final, private moment of closure that had nothing to do with law or money. Months after the settlement, when things had a way of feeling awkward but better, Michael came to my house one evening. He stood by the gate as if rehearsing, then walked up the path. He looked older. Stress had feathered his face a little. He knocked, and I opened the door without fanfare. He placed his hands on the narrow rail of the porch and said, simply, "I'm sorry." His voice was small, honest. He said, "I thought I could protect you by not making a big fuss. I thought I was being considerate. I was wrong. I should have told you. I should have invited you." There was an apology for the secrecy and something like regret for the hurt he caused. I said, "Thank you. That's what mattered." But there was more. "Do you understand why I did what I did?" I asked him. He nodded. He said yes. There was a humility there I hadn't seen in years. We sat and drank tea, and without promises to be perfect, acknowledged the imperfect ways families learn to be kind again. What would you have done in my shoes? It's a question I asked myself throughout the process, not as a rhetorical device, but as a compass. Would you have forgiven sooner? Would you have escalated further? Be honest, would you have waited this long for payback, even if the payback was legal and measured? People on the internet love binary answers, revenge or forgiveness. But real life sits in the messy middle. My revenge was not a flaming spectacle. It was a slow, patient salvage of dignity through the instruments available to me. It was material and legal, yes, but it was also symbolic, an insistence on being a stakeholder in my own story. After the storm, the house felt like a place that belonged to me, in a new way. Not because the law had declared me victorious, but because I had declared myself worthy of being recognized. I went back to the small rituals that used to make life tolerable. I set the table for myself sometimes, sat with a book under a lamp, called my sister to complain about nothing. I planted a small bed of lavender by the kitchen window. When people asked what I wanted to do next, I would say I wanted to travel. But mostly, I wanted to live without the old ache of being unseen. There is a strange kindness to closure that is not cinematic, but real. It is a quiet acceptance that not everything can be smoothed out, that some relationships remain permanently altered. My relationship with Michael was not mended like a broken glass glued together. It was more like a seam that had been stitched and would always show. But the seam was honest. I could see where the needle had passed through, and that visibility was soothing in its own way. I had evidence, legal and personal, that my life mattered to someone. When I look back now, I understand that revenge, when framed as reclaiming dignity rather than inflicting harm, can be a tool of repair. I do not suggest that everyone should go down this road. The way I went about it was bound to my temperament, to my resources, to the particular stubbornness that made me file a codicil instead of shouting in a supermarket. The point is that when you are hurt, the options are fierce and varied. You can shout, forgive, withdraw, or fight. I chose to fight where I could. I chose to protect what mattered to me. And in the end, I found a kind of peace that felt earned, not purchased. People tell revenge stories as if they end at the triumph, but real endings are quieter. They're the mornings when the house smells of coffee and not resentment. The afternoons when you realize you haven't scrolled his social media in days. The small, ordinary moments that stitch themselves back into your life. I have those mornings now. I have the sound of the kettle, the smell of bread, the soft groan of an old chair as I settle into it. I have the knowledge that I stood up for myself in a measured way and that it changed the behavior of someone I love. If you ever find yourself excluded from a life you helped build, consider the tools you have. You might choose to confront with a conversation, to withdraw, to document, to seek legal advice, or to lean on community support. My decision was not one of rage, but of careful, stubborn clarity. I wanted